Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History, as today we see how the South began to fight for their independence. Now, when the Civil War began, neither side was truly prepared. The U.S. Army's main force consisted of about 35,000 troops in Washington, D.C., most of them new recruits who were poorly trained. Although Winfield Scott was in overall command of the Army, his Anaconda Plan was unpopular with overly optimistic politicians and newspaper editors who believed the war could be won in 90 days. The newly promoted Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, a friend of Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase, was placed in command of the troops in Washington, D.C., despite never having led men in combat before, and he was ordered to seize Richmond. He first moved towards the railroad junction at Manassas, Virginia, a little town where two major railroads came together near a creek called Bull Run. And it will often be the case that battles in the Civil War will have two names, Northerners often naming them after a nearby physical feature. So this is typically known as the First Battle of Bull Run, but known to some as the First Battle of Manassas, particularly in the South. At Manassas, or in the First Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the war, Confederate forces were commanded by General Beauregard, who had ordered the bombardment of Fort Sumter. He was later joined by reinforcements commanded by Joseph Johnston, who arrived at Manassas by railroad, some soldiers going into battle directly off the train, making this the first battle in the history of the world in which railroads would play a major role, as they would turn out to play throughout the entire war. And it was no secret that a battle would take place here. Indeed, senators and congressmen and newspaper editors from Washington, D.C. came down to watch the battle, bringing their families, their servants, and a picnic lunch, fearing this would be the only battle of the war, and they didn't want to miss the show. And it was a show, but not a great show. The battle was a mess in many ways, and neither side was, for the most part, that well trained. Uniforms were not yet all that uniform, so while in principle the Union wore blue and the Confederacy wore gray, the fact was most men had been called up from militia units which had widely varying uniforms. Some Yankees wore gray, some rebels wore blue, some men wore brown or green, a number had red pants, which was the fashion for soldiers at one time. And so there were cases where soldiers from one side were able to overrun soldiers from the other side because the men they captured were not even aware the men approaching were in the other army and were then captured without firing a shot. There are also sad cases of men shooting other soldiers in their own army because they were wearing the wrong color uniform. Likewise, the flags carried by the soldiers had the same confusing problem. The flag of the North, of course, was the Stars and Stripes, while the new national flag of the Confederacy was the Stars and Bars. The similarities between the two flags should be fairly obvious, and the differences, sadly, were not obvious on the battlefield. Again, soldiers and officers sometimes had trouble telling which flag belonged to which side. As in those days, most units did carry flags, a national flag and a distinctive regimental flag, to distinguish them from other units, so that officers watching from a distance could tell which unit was which by the flags they carried, except in this battle they often couldn't. This would lead, in the Confederacy, to the adoption of the famous Confederate battle flag to be carried in place of the Stars and Bars by many soldiers, especially in the eastern part of the war. It was used some in the Western theater as well, although in many Western armies other distinctive flags were adopted too, but still a move away from the Stars and Bars for many regiments. And at first, the Confederates were outnumbered and did seem to be losing. Again, as reinforcements came in off the trains, things began to turn. Furthermore, as Confederate troops were on one part of the battlefield beginning to run, a Texan general, Barnard Elliott B., saw a brigade of troops from Virginia standing firm, under the leadership of General Thomas Jackson. General B said, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." And the Confederates stopped retreating, began to fight back, and General Jackson was known as Stonewall Jackson ever afterwards. And so, facing newly stiffened resistance and a new load of troops off the trains, Federal troops turned and ran all the way back to Washington, D.C. And had the Confederate Army been better organized, more accustomed to combat, they might have chased them all the way back and maybe ended the war right there. But honestly, for all Southerners expected to be able to easily beat the soft Yankees, they weren't really that much better prepared, and they sat on the battlefield resting in their victory. The North had about 2,900 casualties, and by casualties we mean killed, wounded, and captured. The South about 2,000. Compared to later battles of the war, not an especially bad battle, but compared to any previous war Americans had fought, a shockingly high number. Indeed, the Federal Army was so demoralized they fought no more major battles the rest of the year. They did not invade the South, and the South didn't need to invade the North. This demonstrated for the North, at least for some Northerners, they truly were in for a long and bloody war. It gave the South perhaps a false sense of security. And this battle, like so many to come, would be so bloody in large part because Americans were now using new types of weapons, but their officers were still trying to fight with old tactics. Both sides, especially as the war progressed, primarily fought with rifles, as opposed to the older muskets used in previous wars. The difference, of course, is a musket has a smooth bore. The inside of the barrel is smooth. A rifle has a thicker barrel with grooves carved into it. Those grooves had a slight twist. So as the bullet comes out of the barrel, there's a little bit of a spin on it, making it more accurate. And these were bullets. All they called the type of bullet usually used in the Civil War a Minie Ball, after its French inventor, a man named Minie. And the fact they were used to firing balls out of guns, these were bullets. They were conical, and furthermore, they had some grooves near the back and a hollowed out place near the back. So when the gunpowder exploded in the back end of the barrel, that grooved hollow place would spread out and the soft lead would grip the grooves of the barrel tightly, making that spin even more effective. So whereas a musket had been considered dangerous to maybe 50 yards or probably less, rifles firing Minie Balls were useful up to at least 500 yards and somewhat dangerous further away than that. There were some rifles used by snipers that could kill a man over a mile away. Furthermore, these rifles were now using percussion caps, a chemical igniter inside a little brass cap, rather than flint and steel, as had been the case for over a century before. So they're more reliable, as well as more accurate. But all the generals had learned to fight like Napoleon, planning to get in a line, fire a volley or two, and then charge and overwhelm the enemy with the bayonet, as men had fought for well over a century. But while this had worked pretty well in the 17 and early 1800s, when you might fire a shot or two and then charge, and the enemy can only fire one or two back, now you can be picked off for hundreds of yards before you get to the enemy, leading to many deaths that might have been avoided, had tactics better suited the weapons they had. About 90% of the casualties in the Civil War were inflicted by rifles. Less than 1% were actually inflicted by bayonets. The 9% in between was mostly made up by artillery, although there were some wounds from swords and pistols and other weapons. On the seas, the Confederacy revolutionized naval warfare. Taking an old wooden steam frigate called the Merrimack, the Confederates bolted iron plates to the ship's hull to create armor, renaming the ship CSS Virginia. This would be described as an ironclad. While there had been some experimentation with armored ships in Europe, this would be the first ironclad used in battle. And while Virginia was not an especially well-built or seaworthy vessel, She was the best armored ship on Earth. It was feared she would sail up the Potomac, bombard Washington, D.C., and make all existing wooden navies obsolete. The North responded by hiring an engineer named John Erickson and giving him all the money he needed to build USS Monitor in 100 days. This was better because it was designed to be an ironclad, not just a converted steamboat. The Virginia, for example, was rather top-heavy. USS Monitor floated almost entirely underwater with just the very surface of the ship and a turret that could rotate, exposed easily to enemy fire. In March of 1862, the Confederacy sent Virginia out to attack the Union blockading fleet. On the 8th of March, 1862, Virginia sank 2 Northern ships and chased another aground, terrifying the Navy while losing no men and taking no serious damage. But the next day, March 9th, the Monitor attacked, and after a long battle that was essentially a draw, Virginia withdrew. Neither ship took any significant damage, but CSS Virginia stayed in port until the Union captured Norfolk, Virginia, at which point the Confederates burned Virginia to keep her from being captured. But both sides, and other navies around the world, built more and more ironclads. The Confederacy would revolutionize naval warfare yet again with the launch of H.L. Hunley in 1863, one of the world's first submarines. Some had been built in the past, even the American Revolution. A little one-man sub called the Turtle, with a drill attached, had sailed under British ships and tried to drill holes in the bottom of them unsuccessfully, British ships typically being copper-plated on the bottom. Hunley went out on a practice cruise and sank, killing the entire crew. But Hunley was pulled up, crewed again, sent out on another practice mission when the Hunley sank, killing the entire crew. With 2 practice missions on the books, Hunley then went into battle. The 17th of February, 1864, with a long pole with an explosive called a torpedo strapped to the front. Hunley rammed USS Housatonic, a U.S. Navy sloop blockading Charleston, South Carolina. The torpedo exploded, blowing a hole in Housatonic and sinking her, the first ship sunk by a submarine in 1864. But Hunley sank too, this time in deep water, and was not found again until 1995. Now, back in Washington, D.C., General McDowell was removed from command and replaced by George McClellan, a graduate of West Point, second in his class in 1846. He'd served with Winfield Scott in Mexico, and he would turn out to be an outstanding administrator, supplying, equipping, training his army into a mighty fighting force, but a force he would rarely use and almost never use effectively. His real skill was in politics, and was able to use his influence to pressure Winfield Scott into retirement in November of 1861. Soon afterwards, McClellan himself became commanding general of the U.S. Army. He saw himself as a young Napoleon, thought he was the only man who could save the nation from the original baboon, who was his commander-in-chief, and the incompetent cabinet that he led. McClellan's men called him Little Mac, a sign of affection, as most loved him, as he loved them. McClellan named his army the Army of the Potomac, and did train and supply and equip it into a magnificent fighting force, but he faced a powerful enemy, his own imagination. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, McClellan would always be convinced the Confederate Army had a vast numerical superiority over his own. And so, 1861 passed into 1862 with no significant federal action, particularly in the East. Lincoln grew impatient, told McClellan if he wasn't going to use the Army of the Potomac anytime soon, Lincoln would like to borrow it. McClellan did not take the hint. Lincoln finally directly ordered McClellan to attack, but even now McClellan was afraid to march straight from Washington to Richmond, instead coming up with a plan that might have been pretty good if he'd followed through properly. His plan was to sail down the coast, and land on the coast of Virginia and march up the peninsula between the York and James rivers towards Richmond and hopefully capture the Confederate capital from behind, getting around the main Confederate army between Washington and Richmond. And he landed troops at Yorktown, Virginia, March 17, 1862, where Washington had beaten Cornwallis almost 80 years before. But while he got around the main Confederate army, he did not believe in his own success. And with his army of 100,000 men, he was outnumbered by 15,000 Confederates and his own imagination. The 15,000 men in Yorktown were commanded by John Magruder, a fan of amateur theater, who fooled McClellan with his theatrics. He had his men march in circles around Yorktown so McClellan would count each one several times. They took logs and telegraph poles and carved them and painted them to look like cannons, pointing them at the Union Army, holding McClellan off for a month or more as Joseph Johnston moved troops into the peninsula. When Johnston was firmly in place between Yorktown and Richmond, Magruder withdrew, leaving the Confederates, or the Union, to discover those Quaker guns had threatened them for so long. And McClellan moved up, facing Joseph Johnston in the Peninsular Campaign. And in the Peninsular Campaign, a whole series of battles. Marching towards Richmond from the southeast, McClellan won many of his battles, or at least fought to a draw. These battles were numerous, though, and bloody, shockingly bloody for a nation who had not fought many big battles in our history. Furthermore, fairly early in the campaign, in a battle the Confederates call Fair Oaks, the Yankees called Seven Pines, May 31st to June 1st, 1862, Joseph Johnston was wounded and relieved of command while he recuperated. Johnston later said being shot at Fair Oaks was the best thing he ever did for the Confederacy because he was replaced by General Robert E. Lee, who renamed his army the Army of Northern Virginia and began to fight back, pushing McClellan hard, attacking him many times in many places, primarily in a series of very bloody battles known as the 7 Days, lasting from June 26 to July 2, 1862. McClellan won many of the battles of the 7 Days, making it one of the few Eastern campaigns with significantly higher Confederate casualties than Union casualties, over 20,000 Confederate casualties compared to a little under 16,000 Union casualties. But the constant pressure on McClellan, combined with his certainty the Confederates outnumbered him, led him to retreat. He might win a battle, or at least fight it to a draw, but then would retreat. Win, lose, or draw, he pulled back time and time again, abandoning the peninsula and returning to Washington, where Lincoln was rather put out. Many of his advisors wanted McClellan removed, but Lincoln thought he might still be useful. McClellan had many political allies and was very popular with his men. But Lincoln did take part of McClellan's army away and put about 75,000 of his soldiers under the command of General John Pope, who had won some victories out west. And Pope marched into Virginia, saying his headquarters would be in the saddle. But aware of where Pope was going, in part because his own cavalry, led by Jeb Stuart, scouted out all his moves, General Lee prepared to meet him, sending Stonewall Jackson to stop him near Manassas. The Second Battle of Manassas would be fought August 28th through August 30th, 1862, so also known as the Second Battle of Bull Run. First Stonewall Jackson and Lee's entire army fighting Pope, and although Pope had 75,000 men and Lee about 55,000, Pope was forced to retreat and reassigned to a post out west to fight the Indians. And his men were all given back to McClellan. So with the Union in retreat from Peninsula and John Pope's defeat at Manassas, the North seemed to be in bad shape in the summer of 1862. Furthermore, the blockade although enjoying some success, had suffered a pretty close scrape in its battles with Virginia. But Virginia had been turned back by the Monitor, and out west things were going better. As the commander of the U.S. Navy's Gulf blockading squadron, Admiral David Farragut, born just outside Knoxville, Tennessee, but remaining loyal to the Union, captured the city of New Orleans on May 1st, 1862, after a week-long siege. And in New Orleans and elsewhere, Union forces began freeing slaves, saying that they were contraband, that they were valuable supplies that could support the Confederate war effort. And although these contraband, as runaway slaves quickly came to be known, were often required to work for the Army, in some ways sort of transferring their ownership from their plantation master to the U.S. Army, most slaves much preferred that to real slavery. And this put Lincoln in an awkward position. He didn't like slavery, to be sure, but he didn't feel the Constitution let him abolish it. He had promised he was not fighting to end slavery, but to preserve the Union, and he feared if he did attack slavery, that might offend the border states, the 4.5, if we count West Virginia, slave-owning states that had remained mostly loyal to the Union. Should he try to free all the slaves, those border states might turn against him. He said that if he could save the Union by freeing all of the slaves, he would do it. If he could do it by freeing some, he would do it. If he could save the Union without freeing any slaves, he would do it. However, a growing number of Northerners, particularly within the Republican Party, did want to free the slaves. And Ney and Lincoln considered justifying this on the grounds of hurting the Confederate war effort, an emergency military measure. And so Lincoln wrote up an Emancipation Proclamation, which declared to be free all slaves in areas presently in rebellion, but not in the loyal border states or in parts of the Confederacy occupied by the Union when this went into effect. And in principle, too, a Confederate state who rejoined the Union very quickly might be able to hang on to their slaves if they joined up before this went into effect. But while Lincoln wrote this, his cabinet advised him not to make it public yet, unless it might look like an act of desperation. They should wait till we've won a major victory, and so he waited for the moment he could make this grand gesture. But the South, too, needed a grand gesture. The plan to get European help by stopping cotton shipments had not worked. Southern leaders felt the South needed to win a major victory outside the South. And so General Lee planned an invasion of Maryland. In a slave-owning state with many Southern sympathizers, it was hoped that if the Confederate Army moved into Maryland, Marylanders might rise up against the Union. Confederate troops marching in sang "Maryland, My Maryland," a recent song about resisting Yankee tyranny, sung to the tune of "O Christmas Tree." But most Marylanders did not rise up. The Confederate Army looked pretty ragged by this point. And so one part of Lee's plan did not work, making it hard to do as he hoped and get around behind the Army of the Potomac and maybe even capture Washington, D.C. itself. What really did Lee in, though, was that one junior officer took Lee's special order, number 198, his particular unit's copy, wrapped it around 3 cigars to keep him safe, but then dropped the whole package. And Special Order number 191 laid out Lee's entire plan for the battle, revealing what men he had, where those men were, and where those men were to go, and laying out all his plans. These lost orders were discovered by a Union sergeant. They were taken to General McClellan, who then refused to believe them. Because they revealed that in contrast to his own 87,000 men, Lee had only 40,000. So, because this showed that McClellan was not outnumbered, he assumed it was a trick. McClellan was reluctant to move or act in any way, although eventually he did move and caught up with Lee at a town called Sharpsburg along the Antietam River. So this is sometimes known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, also as the Battle of Antietam, where on September 17th, 1862, the two sides fought across Antietam River, along roads east of town, in the fields north of town. It would be a terribly bloody battle, the bloodiest single day in American military history, with over 26,000 men killed or wounded. And had McClellan moved his reserves into battle, instead of always holding them back out of fear that some future Confederate force might appear, he might have won. At different points in the day, his men would gain the advantage in different parts of the battlefield. Again, with reinforcements, they might have pushed all the way through and won a massive victory. Instead, the battle ended up as a draw. Although a draw, and so bloody, that Lee did finally choose to abandon the battlefield and pull back towards Maryland. The Confederate hope of winning a major victory in the North and getting European assistance, just as the United States had done after the great victory at Saratoga, had not worked out. And following this, Lincoln did remove McClellan from command and replaced him with one of the generals who had fought under him at Antietam, General Ambrose Burnside, a man famous for his side whiskers. Indeed, photographs would lead to facial hair on the side coming to be known as Burnsides, and later as sideburns. And furthermore, while the Battle of Antietam was a draw on the battlefield, it was a strategic victory. Lee's invasion had been stopped, and Lincoln declared it to be a major victory and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This would take effect January 1st, 1863, giving the South a couple of months to react. The Emancipation Proclamation officially freed slaves in rebellious areas, largely in the hope that they would revolt, which they mostly didn't. But it also meant that if they escaped to Union lines, they would be forever free. And as the Union Army pushed deeper into the South, any slaves they encountered in rebellious areas they could free with no question at all. Furthermore, many of those escaped slaves and many free blacks in the North now joined the Union Army, which began accepting black volunteers in 1863. About 180,000 black soldiers ultimately served in the war, accounting for close to 10% of all Union forces. When given the chance to fight, which they were often denied because many white officers believed they couldn't fight, but when given a chance to fight, they often fought very bravely. And despite often getting poor treatment by their own white officers, not being able to have black commissioned officers, and early in the war getting unequal pay, $10 a month as opposed to $13 paid to a white soldier, and actually less than $10 because a black soldier had $3 deducted to cover the cost of his uniform, a white man getting his uniform for free. Congress eventually reversed that policy, paying black and white soldiers the same, and even giving black soldiers back pay for the months they had been paid less. But paid well or not, they fought bravely when they could. They also faced great danger. If they were captured by the Confederacy while under arms, they would be executed. And so surrendering black soldiers were often killed, most infamously in the Fort Pillow Massacre, where hundreds of surrendering black troops were massacred in 1864 by men under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest. So for the moment, only freeing slaves in areas where the Union had no power, this is a symbol more than anything else, but a very powerful symbol. After this, now that the war is openly about ending slavery, European governments could not easily side with the Confederacy. Prior to this, Britain in particular But France, too, had been on the verge of recognizing the Confederacy and offering to mediate a peace when the invasion of Maryland began. Now, General Burnside knew that McClellan had been too cautious, although he was also cautious by nature. But he felt he had to invade Virginia, and he planned to cross the Rappahannock River to attack Fredericksburg, Virginia. But to cross the river, which was relatively wide and deep there, he had to build a bridge and ordered pontoon boats from the Army Supply Department. These boats would then be stretched across the river and planks nailed across them to make pontoon bridges. But this took a long time. The Army was real slow in getting him the boats he wanted, and this gave Lee time to position about 78,000 men just beyond town, just south of Fredericksburg. And where Lee was able to position many of his men on a low ridge known as Marie's Heights. There was also a stone wall just next to the ridge where many of his men could take shelter as well. A Confederate artilleryman said a chicken could not live on that field when we opened fire upon it. While preparing to cross the river, Burnside's men shelled Fredericksburg. Once the Union's 115,000 men were in the city, they looted the city, and in turn were shelled by the Confederates. Not much was left of Fredericksburg by the end of December 1862. With most of his forces finally across the river, on December 13th, Burnside ordered a charge against a Confederate position, where they were all turned back or shot dead by Confederate forces in a strong defensive position on Marie's Height. But the first charge failing, he ordered another charge, which was turned back. So he ordered another charge, and another charge, and another charge, and yet another charge. A further charge, another charge, a charge again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. A total of 14 charges against Confederate forces at Fredericksburg, all of which were defeated before they ever reached Lee's men. Some units lost half their men or more. Many men who were not killed were trapped on the battlefield overnight, afraid to move lest they be seen and shot. Some piled up dead men next to them to use as walls to protect them from Confederate bullets. Others lay right beside their dead comrades and pulled over the flap of their coat for some kind of blanket during the cold December night. During that night, the northern lights were visible in the sky, very rare so far south. The aurora borealis was seen by Southerners as a sign of God's favor. On the 14th of December, Burnside considered leading his old 9th Corps in one last attack against the wall, but was talked out of it by his officers, and apparently did not really have the stomach for a suicide mission. So the Battle of Fredericksburg was a great Confederate victory, the North losing over 13,000 men killed and wounded, compared to about 4,200 for the Confederacy. Burnside retreated back across the Rappahannock River on December 15th and was soon demoted back to the command of a single corps and was replaced as commander of the Army of the Potomac by Joseph Hooker, another man who had led troops at Antietam. And Fighting Joe Hooker, as he was named, almost immediately moved against Lee. Now, he left about a third of his army behind across the river from Fredericksburg as a diversion, but then moved up the Rappahannock River with about 97,000 troops to a shallow place in the river where he crossed easily, as probably Burnside should have done the previous winter. Lee chose to follow him, and Hooker had hoped he would leave enough men behind at Fredericksburg that Lee would have to stay there to guard the city. But although Lee was badly outnumbered, he risked leaving some men behind and pursuing Hooker up to the northwest, meeting him at a place called Chancellorsville, which would suggest this was a town or a village or something. Really, it was just a strategic crossroad where there was a plantation owned by the Chancellor family. Chancellorsville was a mansion and some barns and slave buildings and other outbuildings around. Lee was vastly outnumbered. but again split his army at great risk. Where of the 57,000 men he had against Hooker's 97,000, he sent about half of them to march all the way around Hooker's forces. Lee pressuring Hooker from the east, again almost half his army, under the command of Stonewall Jackson, marching through roads in the woods south of Hooker's men, guided by local people supportive of the Confederacy. Getting around Hooker's army, he caught them completely off guard. And Hooker apparently spent most of the battle stunned, giving no useful orders at all. So that the first day of the battle, May 2nd, 1863, went very badly for the Union. Although it had taken Jackson so long to get around Hooker's army that he wasn't able to completely defeat him on May 2nd. The battle ended when it became dark. Jackson wanted to plan the next day's combat and rode out in the darkness to scout the Union defenses. As he and his staff rode back towards Confederate lines, they were not recognized by their own men, and soldiers from North Carolina fired on them, hitting Jackson 3 times. He had to have his left arm amputated and go home to recover. Lee said of Jackson, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." And Jackson's arm was buried near the battlefield. Should you ever visit the Chancellorsville battlefield, you can visit the grave of Stonewall Jackson's left arm. The tradition is to leave a lemon. Jackson died of pneumonia a week later at his home on May 10th, 1863. Still, Hooker remained off balance. And although Lee did not push him as hard as he might have if Jackson had survived, he still pushed Hooker, and he retreated back across the Rappahannock River, where he was replaced after a time by another general, George Meade. And although Lee was saddened and worried by the loss of Jackson, he was also confident following these great victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville often being considered Lee's most brilliant tactical victory. And so he decided once again to invade the North, and hoping to threaten Washington, D.C., and force Lincoln to negotiate a peace. And so he moved into Pennsylvania, with the hope of threatening Washington. But in this invasion, Lee would be let down by all of his corps commanders. The first to let him down was the commander of his cavalry, James Ewell Brown Stuart. Now, Jeb Stuart was brilliant and very talented, but he was young and vain and liked to see his name in the papers. He was already famous for leading his cavalry in a circle completely around John Pope's army back in 1862, and even stealing cash and Pope's spare coat out of his headquarters. And now in Pennsylvania, as he went scouting, he scouted too far out, was unable to communicate what he was learning to Lee. So Lee's men were moving blindly. Ordered not to engage the Union yet. Lee wanted to find just the right place to fight, but without any information about where enemy forces were, some units in Lee's army collided accidentally with Union forces at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1st, 1863, where they would end up fighting possibly the most important battle of the war, and certainly the largest battle ever fought in North America. And the Battle of Gettysburg lasted 3 days, in which the U.S. Army in total fielded about 83,000 men, the Confederates almost as many, 75,000 men. Well, again, with the battle being completely unplanned, in both armies, units arrived a few at a time, a regiment, a battalion, a corps coming up the road here and there. Had either side fully understand the enemy's position, they probably could have moved and destroyed the enemy army one piece at a time. But neither ended up doing so. And as the battle progressed, Lee's various corps commanders again let him down. Lee had not wanted to fight at Gettysburg, but once there was an engagement of some troops, he decided to go ahead and have a major engagement. He ordered Richard Ewell to take the high ground just outside of town, but Ewell, who was newly promoted to corps command, and being a bit timid after losing a leg at 2nd Manassas, did not move quickly or seize the hills he was supposed to. Stonewall Jackson might have if he still commanded the 2nd Corps, but he'd been dead for almost 2 months. July 2nd, Lee planned a two-pronged attack. Ewell was to try again to attack the northern end of the Union line, mostly as a diversion, while General James Longstreet's corps attacked the southern end. And yet neither man attacked when he was supposed to, nor did the two attack at the same time, as they were also supposed to. Longstreet had held the wall at Marye's Heights, didn't think it was wise to attack Union forces on the high ground. He also saw signal flags on top of the hill and believed he was being watched, and so he began a long series of countermarches, moving his army back and forth to confuse the enemy. In fact, it just tired his own men out and delayed them, giving the Union time to move more men onto Little Round Top. Eventually, Longstreet attacked, although again not coordinated with Ewell, who should have already attacked, although in fact didn't, and attacked even later. Longstreet's men would fight men under the command of General Daniel Sickles. First of all, Sickles would have his legs shot off by a cannon and donate it to the Army Medical Museum and visit the bones every year on July 2nd. And they fought in a rocky area called Devil's Den. Union Confederates also fought at a nearby peach orchard. Union forces were eventually pushed aside, and Longstreet's men did make it to the top of Little Round Top, a rocky and wooded hill at the southern end of the Union line. The very last unit on Little Round Top to defend it was a regiment from Maine, the 20th Maine, under Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a college professor on leave of absence. When his men ran out of ammunition, he ordered his men to fix their bayonets and charge down the hill, in one of the few successful uses of the bayonet in the Civil War, driving Longstreet's men back. July 3rd, Lee told Longstreet to attack the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Once again, it took him a long time to get ready. Eventually, he put together about 12,000 men, including one division led by General George Pickett. Pickett's men accounted for about 5,000 of the 12,000 men involved in this attack, but his was the lead unit, and he was the leader in talking about himself after the war was over, so this attack would be known as Pickett's Charge. It was preceded by a tremendous artillery barrage, the loudest sound ever produced in North America, heard over 100 miles away in Philadelphia. And Confederate troops marched across a huge open field under heavy fire from Union artillery. As they got closer, they were cut down by Union rifle fire, with many Yankee troops protected by a long stone wall. Indeed, afterwards, many of them chanted Fredericksburg, because they had defended a wall just as the Confederates had defended against them at Fredericksburg. Very few Confederate units even made it to Union lines. The few that did were immediately pushed back or captured. That spot where they did make it is sometimes called the high water mark of the Confederacy, the farthest the Confederacy ever got, from which afterwards they would recede. Most Confederate units were badly depleted. All were forced to retreat. Overall, 60% of the attacking force was killed or wounded. This was a huge error on Lee's part, and Stonewall Jackson was gone. The remaining Southern generals were too cautious. And again, this was a battle the South probably could have avoided, or had his corps commanders acted better, maybe even won. But that last day in particular, Pickett's Charge, was a true waste of Lee's men. But in the minds of many Southerners, it was the mystical moment when the war could have been won. Again, as close as they got, but not close enough. Lee told his men it was all his fault and tried to apologize, but his men wouldn't let him do so. Still, after the terrible casualties of Pickett's Charge, on the next day, July 4th, 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia began to retreat back to the south, followed by a 17-mile-long wagon train loaded down with supplies and wounded men. And once they made it back to Virginia, they would never again leave their state. There were, North and South put together, around 51,000 American casualties at Gettysburg. About 28,000 from the South, 23,000 from the North, the largest battle ever fought in North America. All the end of the battle was not the end of the story. With thousands of dead soldiers left behind, the Army and the residents of Gettysburg began to bury the corpses. In November of 1863, Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg to help dedicate the new Gettysburg National Cemetery. And at this dedication, Abraham Lincoln told his audience to dedicate themselves to the cause for which the brave men, living and dead, had struggled there. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, might not perish from the earth.